Elizabeth is a princess who has just been called out in a banquet hall by her fiancé, Prince Freer. He says he is dissolving their engagement because he believes Elizabeth pushed his darling Sylvie down the stairs, so in other words, he wants to crack Sylvie. Elizabeth has no idea what he's talking about since she did absolutely no such thing. But Freer is too self-absorbed to care about a word she has to say, so on top of rescinding their engagement, he also sentences her to confinement in the dungeon. Elizabeth had been engaged to Freer for many years at this point, and she was fully invested in their relationship and did everything she could to improve herself so she could support him. She even ended up taking on a bunch of tasks that were meant to be the prince's job, and she didn't even question it at the time. Her maid would constantly warn her not to stay up too late at night because it's bad for her health. But Elizabeth would say she just needed to finish one last report because the prince was too busy with a meeting to do it himself. However, that meeting she was referring to was more of a party than an obligation, so basically, the prince had offloaded all his work onto Elizabeth so he could go have fun. At this point, Elizabeth was still trying to convince herself that all this was perfectly normal, so she told her maid she was fine with the way things were since she actually got things done a lot quicker when the prince wasn't around. Also, she's not doing it just for Freer's sake, but rather for the sake of the subjects, because she doesn't want them to have to suffer if matters like this are left unattended. On top of handling all the prince's political affairs for him, Elizabeth also runs a company known as Funnel Corporation, and it has been doing really well lately. So Elizabeth plans to expand so they can hire more employees. The whole reason she created the company in the first place was so she could give back to the community and use it to partake in philanthropic activities to help the poor. As a result of all her kind actions, Elizabeth has become quite popular amongst the townspeople, and they all say they'd love to thank her personally for all her help. But Elizabeth has always been too embarrassed to receive direct praise, so she has never actually revealed herself as the one behind the Funnel Corporation, and as such, no one recognizes her as she's walking by. And she was perfectly fine with things this way because she only wants to make the people happy and couldn't care less about receiving praise or recognition for it. The next day, while Elizabeth was busy with another large pile of paperwork, the prince finally rolled out of bed and came into her office to tell her that the Gecko Group, the ones who invited him to that party the other day, are requesting access to the royal treasury to expand their business, so he wants her to write up the appropriate paperwork for it. However, Elizabeth immediately tells him she's not going to approve such a request. She had looked into the Gecko Corporation, and she found out that they've been skimming a lot of profit off their books lately, so if they were given access to the royal treasury, they'd no doubt start skimming there too. The prince becomes annoyed when she says that because he is trying to impress his new friends, and if Elizabeth rejects their proposal, then it's going to ruin his street cred with them. He tells Elizabeth to just do as he says because she's just his fiancée. But Elizabeth doesn't back down because she knows the rules are on her side, and agreeing to such a request would harm the royal family's reputation as a whole, so there's nothing Freer can say to change her mind. The prince then storms off in anger, and once he is gone, Elizabeth gets the attention of Freer's knight and asks him to please keep an eye on the prince so he doesn't end up getting tricked by any ill-intentioned individuals. Robert understands what she's trying to say, and he says the prince was probably just too tired from the trip back to think things through properly. Elizabeth sure hoped that was the case because an idea like giving a group of corrupt officials direct access to the royal treasury could have easily caused the decline of the kingdom. And Elizabeth wants to prevent something like that at all costs, because when a kingdom declines, it's the ordinary people who suffer the most. A little while later, Elizabeth is preparing to head out because now that she's done with the work for today, she finally has time for a much-needed break. So she asks Michelle to get her carriage ready because she wants to make every minute count. However, before she could leave, her father suddenly comes into the office looking for her. He is here to inform Elizabeth that an emergency meeting has been called in regard to recent monster activity, and the king will have to attend. So as the king's right-hand man, Elizabeth's father will have to go as well. Elizabeth asks when this meeting is scheduled for, and he tells her it's next week. But that's really bad news since next week was meant to be the kingdom's anniversary party. She says they are going to have to cancel the party now, but her father tells her they can't since the guests from faraway places must already be on their way by now. Thus, he says the party will be held as planned, and Elizabeth doesn't see how that's going to be possible with both the king and the chancellor away, but he explains that the king has personally entrusted everything related to the party into the hands of Elizabeth. She is shocked when she hears this and tries to refuse at first, but her father tells her that the king firmly believes that all will go well if she is left in charge, and he has no one else he trusts as much as her. So her father asks her to take on the task, and when he puts it like that, Elizabeth doesn't really have much of a choice. She's a bit upset that she didn't get a chance to enjoy her day off, But there's no time to worry about that because she has a lot of work ahead of her if she wants to make sure the anniversary party is a success. While she's in the middle of thinking about what to do, Michelle looks out the window and notices the prince openly flirting with Sylvia. She was appalled by how openly Freer was cheating on Elizabeth, but Elizabeth didn't really care since it's fairly common for a prince to have more than one consort, and she really doesn't have anything against Sylvia. Her only gripe is the fact that Sylvia was only recently adopted into a baron family and hasn't learned the proper etiquette for interacting with royals, but she doesn't think it's going to cause any problems. Elizabeth later invites Sylvia to have some tea with her in her room, and there, she politely warns Sylvia that if she wants to pursue a relationship with the prince, then she must be aware of the fact that her behavior can affect not only herself, but the prince's reputation and the reputation of the kingdom as a whole. Elizabeth then points out the injury Sylvia currently has on her leg, and the reason she's bringing it up is because she happened to find out that Sylvia got that injury while on an outing with a certain nobleman who isn't the prince. Now, Elizabeth is a civil lady, so she isn't going to call Sylvia out as the two-timing hoe she is. After all, the prince is pretty much doing the same thing to her, so she doesn't care about their messy relationship, but she does care about the image of the kingdom, so she tells Sylvia to refrain from cheating on the prince from now on. Sylvia keeps her head down and apologizes, but as she is leaving Elizabeth's room, she looks visibly pissed about the fact that Elizabeth caught her. At that moment, the prince just so happened to be walking by, so Sylvia got an idea to get back at Elizabeth and decided to play the victim in front of the prince. She turned on the waterworks and pretended to fall over in front of him, and when he asked her what happened, she pointed to the injury on her ankle and told the prince that Elizabeth was the one who did this to her, which leads us back to the present. Elizabeth tries to explain that she has no idea what the prince is talking about, and that aside, she tells him he shouldn't make such a scene when they've got guests from various different kingdoms in attendance today. But the prince doesn't care at all and orders Elizabeth to be sent to the dungeon for attempting to kill his beloved. Elizabeth still doesn't understand what's going on, and neither do any of the guards. But since Robert is the prince's personal knight, he doesn't hesitate to restrain Elizabeth. As Elizabeth is forced to the ground, she catches a glimpse of Sylvia's sly smile, and she immediately figures out that Sylvia was intentionally framing her for this. Pretty much everyone knows what's happening here is absolute BS, but with the king and her father away at the moment, the prince currently has the highest royal authority in the castle, so none of the guards can afford to oppose his orders right now. Thus, Elizabeth simply agrees to go to the dungeon for the meantime. Later on, word reaches the king, and Elizabeth's father receives news of what happened back in the kingdom while they've been gone, and the king is absolutely astonished by how foolish his son has been because he never could have imagined that he'd throw Elizabeth, the most capable woman in the kingdom, in jail over nothing. He wants to return immediately to set Elizabeth free and lay into his son over this. But this is where we find out that Elizabeth's dad really doesn't give a fuck about her because he just found out that she was unfairly imprisoned. And the first thing he did was convince the king that there was no need to go back because he didn't want to waste any time on Elizabeth. So he's basically leaving her to deal with everything on her own. And the king just goes along with it because he assumes her father would know what's best for his daughter. Back in the kingdom, a month goes by with Elizabeth in prison, and she had initially hoped she'd finally get to take a break from all her responsibilities for once. But even though the prince locked her up, he still somehow managed to force all his administrative work onto Elizabeth. A little while later, Michelle comes down to see Elizabeth while cloaking herself with magic, and to make sure no one suspects anything, Elizabeth uses hypnosis magic to knock the guard out. She then asks Michelle what's going on because she is sure word of this must have reached her father and the king by now, and she expected them to come back to straighten it all out. But Michelle informs Elizabeth that her father actually voted to leave her to figure things out on her own. And hearing that strikes a nerve with Elizabeth because her father always leaves her to deal with the dirty work he doesn't want to handle. And the bad news doesn't stop there because Michelle also mentions that the prince has begun going after her company as well. He is claiming that the Funnel Corporation was run by a traitor, and now he wants to replace all the executives Elizabeth chose with his own lackeys. Elizabeth thinks this is really bad since that idiot is going to destroy the company and put the kingdom in a bad spot. But Michelle doesn't understand why Elizabeth is still thinking about what's best for the kingdom that uses her as nothing but a convenient tool even after everything that has happened to her. Elizabeth agrees that it is infuriating to think about what the prince and Sylvia did to her, or the fact that her own father refused to come help her, but she says none of that is the fault of the people, so she doesn't want to let them suffer. However, Michelle has one more thing to report and informs Elizabeth that the prince and his inner circle have been spreading baseless rumors, accusing her of attempting to assassinate Sylvia and take over the country, and even though he has presented no evidence of this, The people have all begun believing and slandering her name, despite all the good she has done for them. And that was the final straw for Elizabeth, so for the first time she says, "Fuck," and decides she's not going to break her back for this kingdom a second longer. She then punches the wall to let out some frustration, and she thanks Michelle for opening her eyes because she now understands how foolish she has been. She could have broken out of here at any time with how strong her spells are, so she tells Michelle that they are finally going to leave this wretched kingdom. All beings in this world have mana, and a select few are able to control that mana to summon things called divine artifacts. Divine artifacts can be anything, including swords and spears, but in Elizabeth's case, her divine artifact manifests as 7 grimoires. And one of those grimoires allows her to record and manifest any type of magic. When the time comes for her to leave, she creates an ice clone of herself so people don't find out about it immediately. After that, she heads over to the estate of Viscount Lucas of the neighboring empire. Lucas recalls what happened at that party, and he is honestly still shocked that the prince would do something so stupid, because even a complete fool should be able to see that Elizabeth was the one behind most of the kingdom's successes over the past few years. He really wishes he had someone as capable as her on his side, and to his shock, as he is thinking that, Elizabeth suddenly pays him a visit. He is shocked to see her here and asks what she's doing. So Elizabeth explains that she is fed up with being used by the kingdom and would like to seek asylum in the empire. Lucas knows a golden opportunity when he sees one, so he agrees to let her stay in the empire, but he asks what she intends to do while she's here. And Elizabeth explains that she's going to get her revenge by destroying everything she helped build for the kingdom. To be clear, she explains that she has no intention of going directly against the kingdom and starting a war. She is simply siding with the empire because they are in the best position to oppose the kingdom, and though she has no special attachment to them, she assures him that the empire will benefit from the kingdom's downfall. With everything that had just happened, Lucas decides to leave the kingdom immediately since, despite how poorly Elizabeth was treated, she was still incredibly important to their operations. So the palace will be in an uproar once they find out that she's gone. The plan for now is for Lucas to take Elizabeth back to his domain on the border of the kingdom, and he says he's going to have to keep her there under surveillance for the time being, since she is still technically a resident of the kingdom, which Elizabeth thinks is more than fair. Once they finally arrive in Lucas's domain, Elizabeth notices that the people here really seem to like Lucas, which is a good sign, since it means he genuinely cares for his people. And Lucas is proud to say that he thinks he does a pretty good job of governing this land. They eventually make it back to Lucas's mansion, and there Elizabeth tells him she has a request she'd like to make. She asks Lucas to give her permission to open a business in his domain since she needs a way to earn money here, and Lucas isn't opposed to the idea, but then Elizabeth asks him for a loan of 100 gold coins to help her start up her business since all her money was seized back in the kingdom and she's currently flat broke. Lucas is a little hesitant since 100 gold coins is a lot of money, but Elizabeth assures him that she intends to pay it all back, and as proof of her sincerity, she even pulls out a magic contract, a document which binds the users to fulfill its terms whether they want to or not. It basically states that in a year's time, Elizabeth will repay Lucas 2 times his investment, and if she fails to do so, she will allow herself to be sold as a slave to cover the costs. Lucas thinks Ellie must have gone insane because he can't understand why she would come up with terms that are so disastrous for herself, but she says it doesn't bother her since she knows for a fact that she will be able to repay the loan. Since she is being so insistent, Lucas agrees to lend her the money, and the first thing Ellie does is buy a rundown old building for 1 gold coin. She says this is going to be their base of operations from now on, but Myrael is a bit confused as to why she would buy a place like this since it's practically fallen apart. Ellie admits that it's probably going to need a lot of work to fix this place up, but it's the best she could find for 1 gold coin, and they need to conserve as much capital as possible. A few days later, Ellie and Mary are both done renovating the building, and Mary asks if Ellie plans to make the focus of the business cosmetics like she did with her company back in the kingdom, and Ellie says she plans to do that eventually. But right now, they don't have the capital or workforce necessary to make products they can sell to nobles at scale, which is why the first item she plans to put up for sale is this bar of soap. Myrael takes a look at the bar of soap, and she can tell at a glance that it is of higher quality than the soap Ellie sold back in the kingdom, but the profit margins on this are slim, so they won't be able to make much money from it. However, Ellie says making money from the soap isn't her plan. The soap is just a stepping stone to allow her to establish her brand, so she's willing to take a loss on it for now. However, if she wants to establish herself, then she's going to need to build herself at least a few connections, and she knows the perfect place to start. First of all, she heads to the Church of Liberis, and while there, she runs into the head priest. She explains that she recently opened up a new business, so she wants to pray for its success there, and the priest tells her she's more than welcome to, but just then, two kids happily run in. They are here to tell the priest that they made some more money today, and the priest thanks them for their hard work, but he says he is currently busy talking to someone, so they'll have to come back later. The kids understand and happily run off to go play a little, and once they are gone, the priest explains to Ellie that he runs the orphanage next door, and those were a few of the kids he looks after. Ellie says the priest must be doing a really good job since those kids seem really well taken care of, and the priest says he does his best, but he does admit that it has been a little difficult for him since running an orphanage is rather expensive, and though he wanted to keep the kids out of it, they found out that he was struggling financially and volunteered to pick weeds around town to earn a little money to support the orphanage. He feels like he has failed the kids since children their age shouldn't have to work, but Ellie assures him that the kids appreciate what he has done for them. As a matter of fact, she says she'd like to make a small donation to the orphanage, but when she hands the priest 5 gold coins, he tells her he can't accept this much money. Ellie insists that it's not a problem for her, since she sees it as an investment. After all, those kids are going to become her future customers someday, so it's in her best interest to make sure they are taken care of now. After that, Ellie heads home, and when she gets there, she meets up with Mireille, who has been busy all day handing out some of their soap to the maids of nobles so they can build a customer base. And just as expected, within 3 months, their sales have begun growing steadily, and they've been able to expand into other cosmetic products like lotions and shampoos, so they have made a decent amount of money. Ellie has also made it a habit to donate some money to the orphanage every so often, so she asks Mireille to deliver this month's donation for her, and once that's done, she and Mireille head out for lunch together. Ellie is glad that their company has been growing lately, but she's sure their competitors aren't too happy about it. So she asks Mireille if the Gaz's company has made any moves against them yet. She says that they have been mostly quiet for now, so Ellie asks her to continue monitoring them. And she also reminds Mireille to be especially careful not to let the formula for the soap leak since, until they firmly establish themselves, that soap is their lifeline. She also conveniently mentions that the soap's secret formula is hidden in their safe in the store, all within earshot of this guy who happens to work for the Gaz's company. Meanwhile, back in the Gaz's company, Gaz's is absolutely fuming at the fact that the trait company that Ellie started has been stealing more and more of his customers with each passing day. His assistant tries to assure him that it's not a big deal since the trait company is still only a small-scale business, and they don't have that large of a customer base. But Gaz's knows that the trait company must be intentionally limiting their production so they can select customers, and through that means, they have been systematically stealing all of Gaz's good customers and leaving him with all the troublesome customers who complain nonstop. If this keeps up, then Gaz's is going to lose even more money to them in the coming years, but because they've built their client base with influential nobles, he can't risk going after them directly without antagonizing the nobles who buy from them. Just then, there's a knock at the door, and Grants, the one who was at the restaurant, walks in. Gaz's doesn't like Grants and tells him to get out of here because he assumes Grants is here to beg for money, and Grants is a nervous wreck because of all of Gaz's constant yelling, but he works up the courage to tell him that he actually has information on the trait company. Gaz's freezes up when he hears this, and for once, he actually decides to take Grants seriously and asks him what the information is. Grants explains that he was out eating at a restaurant, and he happened to be sitting near 2 girls from the trait company who were talking about how the secret formula was hidden in the company's safe. After learning of this, Gaz's realizes that if they were able to get their hands on that secret formula, then he might be able to make the same soap as Trait, or even better. Take advantage of their already established name to make bootleg versions and make a fortune. He then tosses a bag of coins to Grants as his reward and tells him to get out of his sight and not to breathe a word about this conversation to anyone. Meanwhile, over on Ellie's end, Mireille has just found out that over in the kingdom, she has been branded a traitor and a bounty has been placed on her head. And to make matters worse, it was her own father who took the initiative to bring charges against her despite knowing that everything the prince accused her of was absolute BS. The fact that her own father is willing to sell her out so easily just to cover for the incompetence of the prince hurts, but she can't let herself get distracted by his actions, especially when they are in the middle of their plan to get revenge on the kingdom. A few moments later, there's a knock at the door, and when Mireille answers, she is met by a woman named Hildegard, who says she's here on behalf of the Merchant Guild's legal department to investigate a troubling matter. Ellie remains calm and asks Hildegard what she wants with her. So Hildy explains that there have been reports of Ellie's soap causing severe rashes and sores to customers, so she would like to take Ellie into custody so she can get to the bottom of it. Mireille thinks those are bogus accusations since there's no way their soap would cause such a reaction, But Ellie says there's no need to argue and agrees to go with Hildegard to be questioned because she knows she has nothing to hide. A little while later, Ellie is sitting in the interview room with Hildegard, and after reviewing all the ingredients of Ellie's soap, nothing in the formula seems like it would cause any harm to the customers. As a matter of fact, since Ellie only sells to a select few nobles, she knows for sure that none of her customers have complained of any sores, so she suggests that this must be the work of a copycat brand. Hildegard acknowledges that it looks like Ellie has nothing to do with the incident, and Ellie asks if she could take a look at the bootleg brand of soap that caused the sores. Hildegard hands it over, and after inspecting the soap, Ellie confirms that it is indeed a copycat product, and she suspects it was made using a stolen portion of their recipe. Hildegard asks what she means by that, so Ellie explains that she keeps her recipe in her company's safe, but following that recipe alone would lead to a toxic product, so it needs to be neutralized using the formula from the second recipe, which Ellie keeps on her person at all times. She also suspects that whoever made this soap must be pretending to be a part of the Trait Company to use their brand to attract customers, and after hearing all this, Hildegard is convinced that Ellie is innocent in all this and is in fact the victim of brand theft. She then decides to launch an investigation into whoever sold this soap, and it doesn't take long for her to trace it back to Gazes. When he sees the guild's legal department show up, he realizes it's over for him. But even after being brought in for questioning and being faced with Ellie, who demands compensation for the damage Gazes has done to her brand with his bootleg soap, he still remains smug and tells her he isn't paying a dime in compensation because the guild's enforcers don't have the authority to force him to pay something like that. If she really wanted to claim compensation, then her best bet would be to get a priest from the Church of Liberus to act as a judge, but there's no way she'd be able to convince one of them to go out of their way to settle such a petty matter. However, unfortunately for Gazes, Ellie just so happens to be good friends with one of those priests, and as soon as he heard what happened, he immediately came over to help and rule in Ellie's favor, demanding that Gazes pay compensation for his sins. As a result, Gazes is forced to hand over the managerial rights, equipment, and assets of his company, which is coincidentally exactly what Ellie needs to expand her own operations. This was the end of episode 2. Subscribe to not miss the next part.